A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't sayin' nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a wind that knew nothing of pity, a constant presence that scraped the paint from buildings and the hope from men's faces. In the small, dusty settlement of Redemption, hope was a currency scarcer than water. Cale felt the wind on his high cheekbones, a familiar and unwelcome touch, like the memory of a ghost. He rode not through the town but along its frayed edge, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his presence a silent rebuke to the clamor of civilization. He was a man apart, an Apache who lived in the hills, tolerated by the townsfolk only because he kept to himself and his dealings were honest, if brief. His silence was a shield, his solitude a penance for a loss so profound it had scoured him clean of words. She was young, but her face was smudged with a weariness that aged her beyond her years. She clutched a small child to her chest, a boy with wide, frightened eyes who had buried his face in the folds of her dress. The dress itself was the source of the jeers. It was not a dress at all, but a coarse burlap sack, crudely cut with holes for her head and arms, cinched at the waist with a piece of frayed rope. It was a garment of humiliation, designed to erase her, to make her less than human. Cale saw her flinch with each shouted insult, her shoulders rigid, her head bowed not in shame, but in a desperate attempt to become invisible. He saw the raw knuckles of the hand that held her child, the exhausted slump of her body. He saw a survivor, and in the hollow space where his own heart used to be, something stirred, a flicker of an old fire, a ghost of a forgotten duty. He saw not a woman in a sack, but the echo of a different woman, a different child, under a different, darker sky. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. A large, broad-shouldered man, the town blacksmith by the look of his leather apron, stepped forward. "Look what Martha dragged in," he boomed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the woman's worn-out shoes. "Says her sister's too pretty for her own good. Says she needs humbling." The woman standing beside him, a severe figure with a pinched face, nodded in smug agreement. This was Martha, the architect of this suffering. Cale's gaze flickered from the sister's cruel satisfaction to the woman's concealed face. He saw her tremble, a slight, suppressed shudder that ran through her entire body. The child began to cry, a thin, hopeless sound that the wind snatched away. Cale's hands tightened on his reins. He was a man who had sworn off intervention, who had built a life on the principle of non-involvement. But the child's cry was a key turning in a lock he thought long rusted shut. He swung his leg over his horse, his movements deliberate and calm. The dust settled around his boots. The laughter died as he approached, his shadow falling over the scene. He stopped before the woman in the sack. He did not look at her tormentors. He looked only at her. He remained silent. Then, "If you want to stay." He let the offer hang in the frosty air, incomplete but absolute. She finally lifted her head, and in her tired eyes that had seen everything, he saw not gratitude, but a profound and wary suspicion. Alara had learned that kindness was a trap. It was the sweet bait before the snap of the jaws, the soft word before the blow. Her sister, Martha, had taught her that lesson until it was etched into her bones. Martha, whose jealousy had festered like a wound, had stripped her of her dresses, her dignity, and finally her name, reducing her to this public spectacle. So when the silent Apache rider stood before her, his presence a sudden shield against the town's derision, she did not feel relief. She felt a new, more terrifying kind of fear. His offer, unfinished as it was, echoed in the sudden silence. It was a choice, and she hadn't been offered a real choice in years. She looked at his weathered face, his eyes dark and unreadable, and then at her son, Finn, who had stopped crying and was now peering at the stranger with a child's unfiltered curiosity. Sending her back meant returning to Martha's tyranny, a slow, soul-crushing existence. Going with this man was a leap into an unknown darkness. She swallowed, her throat dry and dusty. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. No words, just a gesture of assent born of desperation. He did not smile or react. He simply turned, took the reins of his horse, and began to walk away from the town, expecting her to follow. The crowd watched, stunned into silence. Martha's face was a mask of fury, her victory stolen. Alara clutched Finn's small hand, her knuckles white. She took a breath. She followed. The journey to his homestead was made in absolute silence, broken only by the plod of the horse, her own unsteady footsteps in the dust, and the biting wind that seemed to push them onward into the wilderness. The sun dipped below the jagged hills, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and bleeding orange. He walked ahead, a tall, solitary figure, never once looking back to see if she was still there. It was a strange sort of trust or perhaps indifference. She wasn't sure which was worse. When they finally arrived, it was to a place that was less a home and more a shelter carved from the harshness of the land. A small, solid cabin of rough-hewn logs stood against a backdrop of rock and scrub pine. A plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast, empty landscape. He opened the wooden door and stood aside, a silent invitation for her to enter. The interior was sparse, clean, and intensely masculine. A single cot, a rough wooden table with one chair, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding a few tin cups and plates. It was the home of a man who expected no one. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her again. She had traded a familiar cage for a stranger's fortress. Where would she and Finn sleep? What did he expect from her? He seemed to read the questions in her rigid posture. He gestured to a pile of clean, folded blankets in a corner. There, he said. It was the first word he'd spoken directly to her since his offer in town. He moved about the small space with an unobtrusive economy of motion. He stoked the fire in the stove, the clinking of metal on metal loud in the quiet room. He filled a pot with water and set it to boil, then spooned coffee grounds into a tin pot. He sliced bread and put a piece of dried meat on a plate, placing it on the table. He did all this without looking at her. As if she were a ghost he was pretending not to see. He then took his own cup of coffee and a piece of bread and went outside, closing the door softly behind him. He was giving her space. He was giving her privacy. It was a gesture so contrary to her experience that it disarmed her. Suspicion warred with a fragile, growing sense of confusion. She crouched by the fire, pulling her son onto her lap and wrapping them both in one of the blankets he had indicated. The warmth from the stove began to seep into her overtired limbs. She watched the closed wooden door, listening to the sound of his footsteps outside, the rhythmic creak of a rocker he must have on the porch. He was out there in the cold so she could be in here in the warmth. For the first time in a long, long time, she was not being watched, judged, or tormented. She was just present. She stayed. The days that followed fell into a routine dictated by the sun and the seasons, a rhythm of work and silence. Alara quickly learned that Kale was a man who communicated through action, not words. Their lives were separate but parallel, two lines running alongside each other in the confines of the small cabin and the surrounding yard. She and Finn slept on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, while he took the cot on the far side of the room. He rose before dawn, the soft sound of him pulling on his boots the only alarm clock. He would leave a bucket of fresh water inside the door and be gone for hours, checking his traps or hunting. When he returned, he would work, chopping wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces, or mending tack with deliberate, methodical movements. He never spoke to her unless necessary, and then only in short, functional phrases. More would storms coming eat yet. His silence was not hostile. It was a deep, settled thing, like a stone at the bottom of a river. It was a wall, but she began to sense it was a wall built to keep something in, not to keep her out. She, in turn, found her place in the quiet. Her existence with Martha had been one of constant, nerve-shredding noise, complaints, orders, insults. Here, the silence was a balm. It allowed her to breathe. She took over the small domestic tasks, not because he asked, but because she needed the purpose. She swept the floorboards, washed their few dishes, and learned to cook with the limited supplies he had, stretching the flour and dried beans into simple, nourishing meals. She would leave his portion on the table, and he would eat it without comment, his expression unreadable. She mended Finn's clothes and then, tentatively, one of Cale's shirts that had a tear in the sleeve. She left it folded on his cot. The next day, she saw him wearing it. No acknowledgement was made, but it was a connection, as tangible as a spoken word. She was no longer just a recipient of his charity. She was contributing. She was earning her keep in the only way she knew how. She was making a space for herself and her son within his solitude. This fragile truce was built on misunderstanding. He saw her quiet diligence and mistook it for contentment. He believed he was providing a sanctuary, a safe harbor from the cruelty of the world, and that was enough. He did not understand the deep well of fear that still resided within her. He didn't see how she flinched if he moved too quickly, or how her eyes would dart to the door whenever she heard a horse in the distance. He thought he was protecting her from the outside world, not realizing that to her, he was still part of that world, a powerful and unpredictable force whose motives she could not fathom. She, in turn, saw his reclusiveness and his silent labor as a kind of judgment. She thought he was merely tolerating her, that she and Finn were a burden he had impulsively taken on and now regretted. She scrubbed the floors harder, cooked more carefully, trying to make herself indispensable, to prove she was worth the space she occupied. They orbited each other like wary planets, held together by a gravity of shared circumstance, but separated by a vast, cold space of unspoken assumptions. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they were too afraid to say. The secret interventions began subtly. They were acts of kindness so quiet they were almost invisible, performed in the periphery of their shared life. One morning, Elara woke to find a small, crudely carved wooden bird sitting on the floor next to Finn's sleeping form. It was smooth to the touch, its simple lines capturing the essence of a meadowlark. Finn, upon waking, clutched it with a gasp of pure delight. It was the first toy he'd ever owned that wasn't a rock or a stick. Elara looked over at Cale, who was staring into the fire, his face impassive, as if he had nothing to do with the small miracle. She knew, though. She had heard the faint sound of a knife scraping against wood late into the night, a sound she had mistaken for him mending a tool. She said nothing, but a tiny crack appeared in the wall of her suspicion. A man who carves a toy for a child he barely knows could not be entirely heartless. The gesture was a message, sent across the silent room. I see him. I see you. A few days later, she noticed the worn soles of her shoes were beginning to part from the uppers. They were the only pair she owned, and the thought of them failing filled her with a familiar dread. The next morning, she found them by the door, not where she had left them. The soles had been carefully restitched with strong, waxed thread, the leather treated with some kind of oil that made it supple again. It was his work. The stitches were small and precise, like the ones on his saddle. He had taken her shoes while she slept, repaired them, and returned them without a word. It was an act of profound and unobtrusive care. He hadn't offered to buy her new ones, which would have felt like charity, an assertion of his power. Instead, he had fixed what was broken. He had honored what was hers. The act went straight to her heart, bypassing all her carefully constructed defenses. It was an intimate gesture, tending to the things that carried her through the world. His most significant intervention was for her. As the nights grew colder with the approach of winter, the single blanket she and Finn shared was not enough. They would wake up shivering, huddled together for warmth. Cale must have noticed, though he never let on. One evening, he returned from a trip to the settlement with his usual supplies, but there was a large, heavy bundle tied to the back of his saddle. He untied it and brought it inside, placing it on the table. It was a thick, heavy wool blanket, dark blue and woven with incredible softness. It was an item of luxury in their sparse world. He simply laid it on the table and turned away to unsaddle his horse, as if the object had appeared by magic. He was giving her a gift without the awkwardness of giving. He was providing, not presenting. That night, wrapped in the deep, comforting warmth of the new blanket. With Finn breathing softly beside her, Alara felt a sensation she had long forgotten. Safety. It was a fragile, tentative feeling, but it was there. These silent acts of his were like stones dropped into the still pool of her fear, sending out ripples of a strange and unfamiliar emotion. Felt something like hope. The sky had been a threatening shade of slate gray for days, and the wind had a new, more vicious bite to it. Cale had been watching the horizon, his face grim. "Big storm," he'd said that morning, the longest sentence he'd offered in a week. He spent the day securing the small homestead, reinforcing the door to the lean-to where his horse was sheltered and stacking extra firewood on the porch. Alara had watched him, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Storms on the plains were not just weather. They were violent, living things that could swallow a person whole. As dusk fell, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that escalated into a shriek. Rain, hard and cold as pellets of ice, began to lash against the small cabin. The world outside the single window dissolved into a churning vortex of darkness and water. Inside, the fire in the stove roared, fighting back against the cold that seeped through the log walls. The storm had forced them into an even smaller space, the world shrinking to the dimensions of this one room. The breaking point came not from the storm outside, but from a storm within. Finn, who had been listless all day, developed a cough. At first, it was small and dry, but as the night wore on, it became a deep, rattling sound that shook his small frame. His forehead was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and rapid. Alara's anxiety turned to raw, primal fear. She held him, rocking him, trying to soothe him with soft, useless words. She tried to give him water from a tin cup, but he could barely swallow. The rattle in his chest grew louder, a terrifying sound that was almost drowned out by the fury of the wind. She felt utterly helpless, trapped in the cabin with her sick child while the world raged outside. Panic began to set in, cold and suffocating. She looked at Cale, who sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, his face a mask of concentration. In her terror, her carefully maintained silence shattered. "He's burning up," she said, her voice trembling, laced with an accusation. "We have to do something." Cale froze, his hands stilling. He looked over at the child, his dark eyes assessing the situation with a calm that infuriated her. He put down his knife and came to kneel beside her. He gently placed the back of his weathered hand on Finn's forehead, his touch surprisingly tender. He listened to the child's breathing, his expression serious. "Fever," he said, his voice low and calm. He stood up and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, one she had never seen him open. He took out a leather pouch filled with dried herbs. The scent that filled the air was sharp and medicinal. He crushed the herbs and steeped them in hot water, then soaked a strip of clean cloth in the mixture. He came back and, with a quiet authority, began to gently sponge Finn's face and chest with the cool, fragrant cloth. He showed Alara how to do it, his large hands guiding her smaller ones. He worked with her through the long, terrifying night. They did not speak, but for the first time they were not in silence. They were a team, united in a single purpose: to fight the fever that threatened the small boy. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, another wall had broken open, washed away by shared fear and a common goal. The fever broke with the dawn. As the first pale winter sun cut through the departing clouds, Finn's breathing eased, and the heat receded from his skin. He slept, a deep and peaceful slumber, with the small carved bird clutched in his hand. Alara, exhausted but flooded with a relief so profound it felt like pain, watched him, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, miraculous rhythm of his breath. Cale sat at the table, watching her, his face etched with the weariness of the long night. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now. It was no longer a space of separation, but one of shared experience, of a battle fought and won together. The storm had passed, both outside and in, but their newfound peace was destined to be short-lived. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the unmistakable clatter of horses and the jingle of harnesses. It was not the sound of a lone rider. It was the sound of a posse. Cale was on his feet in an instant, his body positioned between Alara and the door, a silent, protective instinct taking over. The heavy knock on the wooden door was loud and demanding. Cale opened it to reveal the town sheriff, a man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, flanked by 2 other men. And behind them, her face a triumphant sneer, was Martha. "There she is," Martha shrieked, pointing a bony finger at Alara. "And the savage who stole her. I told you, Sheriff. He took her and my nephew against their will." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. He peered past Cale into the cabin, his gaze falling on Alara, who had instinctively pulled a blanket around herself and Finn, shrinking back toward the hearth. "Ma'am," the sheriff began, his voice apologetic, "your sister has filed a complaint. Says you were taken. Is that true?" Alara's throat closed up. All her old fear came rushing back, cold and sickening. Martha's gaze was venomous, enjoying her public humiliation, reveling in her power. This was her final, cruelest trick, to paint Alara not as a person who had made a choice, but as a helpless victim, a piece of property stolen by a wild man. The townsfolk who had gathered behind the sheriff began to murmur, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Alara lowered her gaze, the weight of their stares pressing down on her. The burlap sack was gone, but the shame remained, a phantom garment she could still feel on her skin. Finn, woken by the commotion, began to whimper, clinging tightly to her. She felt herself disappearing again, shrinking back into the broken, silent woman she had been. But then, something shifted. Cale took a step forward, placing himself more fully in the doorway. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He stood there, a solid, unmovable presence, his silence more powerful than all of Martha's screeching. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on him. He looked from the sheriff to Martha, his eyes holding a calm, deep fire. And then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying with an undeniable finality that cut through the frosty air. "She's with me," he said. He paused, letting the words settle. Then he looked directly at Martha, his gaze stripping her of all her petty authority. "Not bought. Chosen." The words hung in the air, simple, honest, and devastatingly effective. Martha's face went white with rage. The sheriff shifted on his feet, suddenly looking like a man who realized he was on the wrong side of justice. Alara looked up at Cale's back, at the man who had just publicly declared her his. She felt a tear, hot and cleansing, slide down her cheek. He stayed. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the homestead. It was a quiet born not of caution, but of understanding. The sheriff, after a long, awkward moment, had simply tipped his hat to Cale, muttered an apology, and herded a sputtering, furious Martha and the rest of the townsfolk away. He had recognized the truth when he heard it. The door closed, shutting out the world once more. But this time, Cale and Alara were on the same side of it. They were no longer a man, a woman, and a child occupying the same space. They were a unit forged in a crisis defined by a single powerful word: chosen. That evening, as a deep fog rolled in to blanket the hills, they sat on the small porch, a ritual they had never shared before. The air was cold, but neither of them seemed to notice. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a soft, mournful sound. It was Alara who broke the silence. Her voice was soft, unsteady at first, like a bird testing its wings after a storm. She told him about Martha, about the years of quiet cruelty and festering jealousy. She spoke of her beauty being treated like a curse, of being made to feel small and worthless, culminating in the final humiliation of the burlap sack. She spoke not with self-pity, but with the raw, exhausted honesty of a survivor who has finally found a safe place to lay down her burden. She explained that her silence hadn't been stubbornness. It had been a shield, the only defense she had left. As she spoke, she kept her eyes on the swirling fog, afraid to see pity or dismissal in his face. Cale listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes or easy comfort. He just listened, his presence a solid anchor in the shifting mists of her memory. He gave her the gift of his complete, undivided attention, and in doing so, he validated every moment of her concealed suffering. When she finally fell silent, the last of her painful story given over to the evening air, he did not respond with words of his own. Instead, after a long moment, he simply nodded. Then, he raised a hand and pointed toward a small, gentle slope on a hill just beyond the cabin, where a cluster of hardy pines stood guard. There, barely visible in the twilight, was a small, unmarked mound of stones.
Agrave.
He didn't need to explain. The story of his own profound loss, his own deep guilt, was contained in that single, silent gesture. It spoke of a wife, a child, a past that had led him to this solitary existence. It was a confession more powerful than any speech. He was not just a silent, stoic man. He was a fellow traveler in grief, a man who understood the language of loss without needing it to be spoken. Alara looked from the grave back to his face, and for the first time, she saw past the stoicism to the deep well of pain he carried. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. The contact was electric, a current of shared understanding passing between them. They were no longer alone. They had found in each other's scars a map to their own healing. Winter passed, and the deep snows gave way to the muddy, hopeful thaw of spring. Life on the homestead thrived, nurtured by the new, comfortable silence between them. The daily rhythm continued, but its nature had changed. The chores were no longer separate duties but shared tasks. They moved around each other with an easy, unspoken grace, their movements a dance of domestic partnership. When he chopped wood, she would often bring him a tin cup of hot coffee. When she worked in the small garden she had started, planting seeds for squash and beans, he would silently appear to till a particularly stubborn patch of earth with a shovel. They were building something together, more than just a life of survival. They were building a home. Finn, now healthy and vibrant, was the heart of this new home. His laughter was a constant sound, filling the spaces that had once held only quiet tension. He followed Kale everywhere, his small shadow trailing the tall man's. Kale, in turn, accepted the boy's presence with a gentle patience that still astonished Alara. He taught Finn how to identify animal tracks, how to whistle using a blade of grass, and how to skip stones across the small creek that ran through their property. He was becoming a father, not by declaration, but through 1,000 small, reliable acts of tenderness. One afternoon, Alara was sitting on the porch, mending one of Finn's shirts, when she saw Kale looking at her. It wasn't his usual impassive, observational gaze. There was a new warmth in his eyes, a gentle directness that made her heart beat a little faster. He had been watching her more and more lately, a growing softness in his expression that spoke of a deep and steadying affection. He had never said a word about his feelings, but he didn't need to. He showed her every day. He showed her in the way he made sure the woodbox was always full, in the wildflowers he sometimes left on the table, in the protective glance he would send her way when she wasn't looking. His love was like his character. Quiet, deliberate, and utterly reliable. She had arrived broken and disguised, a woman in a sack, and he had seen through the coarse burlap to the person beneath. He had not tried to fix her, but had simply given her the space and safety to heal herself. He had chosen her, and in doing so, he had allowed her to choose herself again. Their homestead, once a symbol of his isolation, was now a place of connection and growth. The small cabin no longer felt sparse. It felt full, brimming with the quiet energy of their shared life. The garden was sprouting green shoots, a testament to their faith in the future. The world of redemption, with its cruel laughter and petty judgments, felt 1,000,000 miles away. It had no power here. Here, strength was measured in resilience. Wealth was counted in shared meals and warm blankets, and love was spoken in the language of quiet, constant care. They had found each other in the dust and desolation, two wounded souls who had learned that together, they were strong. They were more than survivors. They were a family. Winter had passed, and they had created their own spring. It was a true home, built not of logs and stone, but of forgiveness, trust, and a love that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils. There is a truth that lives in the silent places of the world, a wisdom that can only be heard when all the noise has faded away. It speaks in the language of the biting wind and the dusty sun, in the creak of floorboards and the soft breathing of a sleeping child. It is the truth that a home is not a structure, but a sanctuary, and a family is not defined by blood, but by the deliberate, steady act of choosing one another day after day. In the story of the silent rider and the woman in the sack, we see this truth unfold. He, a man locked in a prison of past grief, and she, a woman stripped of her identity by cruelty, were two solitary figures adrift in a harsh land. They were brought together not by grand passion or heroic deeds, but by a single impulsive act of kindness that rippled outward, transforming their world. He did not rescue her in the traditional sense. He simply opened a door and offered her a place to be, a place to heal. Love, the truest and most enduring kind, does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes, it grows in the quiet, tended by small, unobtrusive gestures. It is found in a mended pair of shoes, a carved wooden bird, a shared vigil through a long, feverish night. It is the steady presence that says, without words, "You are safe here. You are seen. You are valued." Kale and Alara built their love from the ground up, with the raw materials of their own brokenness. He learned to let another person into the fortress of his solitude, and in doing so, found that its walls were meant to protect, not to imprison. She learned to trust again, to believe that kindness could exist without a price tag, and in doing so, she rediscovered her own quiet strength and maternal dignity. Their story is a testament to the power of human connection to redeem and to heal, a reminder that sometimes, the most profound emotional revelations happen not in a shout, but in a shared silence. Love grows where no one looks, in the forgotten corners of the world, turning dust and sorrow into a garden. The climax of their story was not a gunfight, but a public declaration of belonging. When Kale stood before the town and said, "Not bought, chosen," he was not just defending Alara, he was claiming his own future. He was choosing connection over isolation, love over grief. And when she laid her hand on his arm on the porch that evening, she was doing the same. It was a quiet exchange, a simple touch, but it held the weight of their entire journey. They had walked through fear, misunderstanding, and silence to arrive at a place of profound closeness. They had faced the ghosts of their pasts, his in the form of a grave on a hill, hers in the form of a hateful sister, and had chosen to face the future together. Theirs is a story of internal transformation, of the slow, patient work of two souls learning to trust not only each other, but the possibility of a shared happiness. It is a melodrama of the heart, where the greatest drama unfolds in the quiet spaces between words, in the gradual rediscovery of a home. As the seasons turned, the rocker Kale had carved for her became a fixture on the porch. It was made of weathered pine, its arms worn smooth from the touch of his hands, and now, hers. He had not presented it to her as a gift. One day, it was simply there, placed in the spot where the evening sun lingered longest. From it, she could watch Finn playing in the yard and see Kale returning from the hills, his tall frame a familiar and welcome sight against the vast, slate evening sky. Their life was a tapestry woven from these quiet, symbolic acts. A bowl of stew left on the stove was a declaration of care. An open window letting in the scent of spring rain was an invitation to hope. There was no need for grand pronouncements. Their life together was the pronouncement. They had built a world on this small patch of land that was impervious to the cruelty and judgment of the one they had left behind. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. One evening, as Alara sat in the rocker, lulling a drowsy Finn with its gentle rhythm, Kale came to stand beside her. He leaned against the porch post, his arms crossed, watching them. The deep fog was rolling in again, blanketing the world in a soft, gray peace. For a long time he was silent, and she was content to sit in that shared stillness. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that was part of the evening itself. "Stay here," he said. It was not a question. It was not a command. It was a simple statement of fact, a confirmation of a truth that already existed between them. It meant this is your home. It meant this is our life. It meant I choose you always. Alara looked up at him, her heart full. She reached out and placed her hand on his, her touch as sure and steady as his own. "We're home," she replied softly. And in that moment, under the vast and quiet sky, their union was sealed, more binding than any vow spoken before a preacher. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Carry the memory of the woman in the sack who found her dignity, and the silent rider who found his voice, not in words, but in love. Remember that strength is often quiet, and the most powerful acts of courage are the ones that happen in the human heart, far from the eyes of the world. Let it be a reminder that everyone, no matter how broken or lost, deserves a place to be chosen. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most.